Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic that's pretty relevant right now with back to school season upon us. School uniforms. Back to school shopping is a pretty huge deal, right? Families spend billions getting their kids ready for the new year, and a big part of that is clothes. Especially for teenagers, clothing is a big part of that whole back to school experience. But it kind of makes you wonder, do school uniforms actually make things easier? It turns out it's a pretty hot topic with some really compelling arguments on both sides. And here's a kind of crazy stat. Uniform use in U.S. public schools has like doubled since the late 90s. It's at 21% now, with almost 60% of schools having some kind of dress code.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the conversation about uniforms often starts with this idea of like cost and simplicity for families.
Right, like uniforms just take the guesswork out of those hectic school mornings. And let's be real, keeping up with the latest trends can be expensive.
Absolutely. When I was a school principal, most parents really loved the idea of uniforms for that exact reason. Less stress, less cost. It was a huge selling point. And it did make a difference. Uniforms definitely helped level the playing field a bit, taking some of that pressure off kids to have the most trendy outfits.
So it created a more inclusive environment in a way.
Yeah, to a certain extent. But I remember reading a teacher's perspective on this, and it really stuck with me. She said, even with uniforms, those economic differences didn't just disappear. Kids would still notice things like who was wearing the same shirt over and over, or who had the slightly nicer shoes. It's like those subtle markers of economic status could still creep in.
That's such a good point. It's like uniforms can only do so much. So what about the safety argument? That seems to be a big one, especially these days.
Absolutely. With school safety being top of mind for everyone, it's no surprise that argument comes up a lot. Uniforms definitely make it easier to spot anyone who doesn't belong on campus, especially in big schools or, those that have multiple programs. Uniforms help staff quickly see who's supposed to be where.
So it's like having this extra layer of visual security. That makes sense. But let's flip the coin for a second. What about the folks who are against uniforms? What are some of their main concerns?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that uniforms stifle a kid's individuality and self-expression. School's such a crucial time for young people to figure out who they are, and their clothing choices are a big part of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like their clothes become this way to express their personality and their interests.
Exactly. And forcing everyone to conform to this one narrow idea of professionalism, well, it can be limiting, even damaging in the long run. Think about it. There are so many different career paths and workplaces out there. As educators, we should be preparing kids for that diversity, not just some cookie cutter corporate image.
So it's not just about stifling creativity, it's also about potentially limiting their options in the future.
Precisely. And this kind of leads to another major criticism of uniform policies, the potential for discrimination. We've seen so many instances where Black students, especially, have been unfairly targeted for their hairstyles, even though those styles are totally common and culturally significant.
It's alarming how often dress codes and uniform policies seem to disproportionately affect low income and minority communities. It raises some serious questions about whether these policies are actually contributing to the school to prison pipeline.
It's a valid concern, and this is where things get really tricky, especially when we start talking about dress codes and the sexualization of young girls. It's a minefield.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. We hear this argument a lot that dress codes are necessary to prevent distractions caused by revealing clothing, especially for girls. But is that really the right approach?
It's complicated. On the one hand, we can't ignore the fact that stores are marketing increasingly sexualized clothing to young people. But the question is, should schools be policing girls' bodies to prevent boys from being distracted?
Right. It seems like that puts the burden on girls to change their behavior and their appearance, to basically accommodate someone else's lack of self control. It sends a pretty messed up message.
Exactly. It just reinforces these harmful gender stereotypes. Instead of teaching girls to be ashamed of their bodies, we need to be having open and honest conversations with young people about healthy choices, about self-image and consent.
But do dress codes actually teach any of those things? Or do they just punish without addressing the underlying issues?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's where I think a lot of schools really miss the mark. I remember reading about a teacher who had a much more effective approach. Instead of just giving a dress code violation, she would pull a student aside and say something like, "Hey, I can literally see your nipples right now. Are you comfortable with that?"
Wow, that's pretty direct.
It is. But it's also respectful. It opens up a dialogue instead of shutting it down. It's about building relationships and addressing these sensitive topics in a way that actually connects with young people.
I love that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that uniforms have some potential benefits, but also some serious drawbacks. And dress codes, well, they're even trickier to navigate in a way that's fair and effective. What's fascinating to me is that this seemingly simple question about clothing actually touches on so many bigger issues: race, gender, equity.
It's true, and that's exactly why this is such an important conversation to have. There are no easy answers, no one-size-fits-all solutions. It requires ongoing dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
So if you were designing a school, would you have uniforms? Why or why not? Something to really think about, right? We'll be back in a flash to dig even deeper into this fascinating topic.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were really getting into the weeds with dress codes and trying to figure out if they even work.
Yeah, and it was really cool to hear your perspective on it as a former principal, having to deal with all those different opinions. Parents who loved uniforms and then students who felt stifled.
Yeah, it definitely required a lot of balance, and I think that's why the best approach always involves open communication and being willing to adapt and evolve those policies.
Okay, so let's talk about some alternatives. If a school doesn't want to do the whole strict uniform thing, what are some ways they can still address concerns about appropriate attire?
Well, there are actually schools and educators who are finding some really innovative ways to approach this.
Well, that's awesome. Tell me more. What are some of the things they're doing differently?
One approach that's gaining some traction is involving students in the process of creating or revising the dress code. So instead of just imposing rules from the top down, some schools are actually having students participate in these open forums or discussions to share their experiences and opinions.
So it's like giving students a voice and making them part of the solution instead of just, being subject to the rules.
Exactly. And when students feel heard and respected, they're way more likely to buy into the guidelines, even if they don't agree with every single one.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like building this sense of shared responsibility and ownership.
Right. Another strategy I think is super smart is focusing on educating students about the why behind certain guidelines. So, instead of just saying, no spaghetti straps, you take the time to explain the reasoning. Help them understand that different settings often have different expectations for how we present ourselves.
Right. So it's less about blindly following rules and more about teaching them critical thinking skills, helping them navigate those social nuances.
Exactly. And those conversations can actually be super engaging. They can lead to these fascinating discussions about social norms, perceptions, and the power of clothing to communicate different messages.
Oh, absolutely. That's way more valuable than just handing them a list of do's and don'ts,
Right. Totally agree. And then there are schools that are moving toward these more flexible dress codes. So they focus on principles rather than specific items of clothing. So for example, instead of banning shorts outright, they might say something like, clothing must be appropriate for a learning environment.
Right. It's a much broader guideline, but it leaves more room for interpretation and individual expression.
It does, but it also requires a higher level of trust and communication between students and staff.
Right. It's about finding that balance between individual freedom and creating a respectful learning environment for everyone. But Let's be real. Not every school is at that point yet. We still hear stories about students being unfairly targeted or punished for their clothing choices. And it seems like it's often based on things like their race, gender, or socioeconomic status.
And that's why it's so important to keep pushing for change. Students, parents, educators, we all have a role to play in challenging these discriminatory policies and advocating for more equitable and inclusive approaches.
So, like, what can people actually do? Like, if they see this kind of injustice happening at their own schools?
Honestly, one of the most powerful things you can do is just speak up. If you see something that seems unfair or discriminatory, document it. Share your concerns with school administrators, the school board, or even connect with advocacy groups that are working on these issues.
So, it's about using your voice and holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. And remember, there's power in numbers. Connect with other parents, students who share your concerns. Together, you can build a much more powerful movement for change.
It's like that saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Mm.
Sometimes you got to make some noise to get people to pay attention.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate social media. Sharing stories, raising awareness, putting pressure on institutions, it can be so effective.
It sounds like we have a lot of tools at our disposal. This whole conversation has really opened my eyes to the fact that this isn't just about clothes. It's about freedom of expression. It's about identity. It's about creating a learning environment where everyone feels safe and respected.
Yeah, that's right. It's a really important discussion because it forces us to confront some deep-seated societal norms and biases.
It's challenging, but it's also really inspiring to see so many young people pushing back against these unfair policies and demanding something better.
It really is. It reminds us that change is possible when we work together and raise our voices.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step in this whole evolution of how we think about dress codes and school uniforms?
I think the key is to shift the conversation away from punishment and control and toward empowerment and dialogue.
Okay, so moving beyond just dictating rules and actually teaching young people how to make responsible choices for themselves.
Exactly. It requires this fundamental shift in mindset. We need to start seeing students as partners in this process, not just subjects to be managed.
That's a really powerful idea.
Hmm.
It's about trusting them, respecting their agency, and creating a space where their voices can be heard and valued. But I think it's important to move beyond the theoretical, to actually look at some real-world examples of how this can work.
I agree. Let's dive into some case studies of schools that are approaching dress codes in these innovative and inspiring ways.
Okay, get ready for some aha moments, listeners. We'll be right back with you after a quick break. Okay, so we're back and ready to hear about those schools that are shaking things up when it comes to dress codes. It's so easy to get caught up in the theory of it all. But I just find it way more inspiring to actually see these ideas in action in real schools. It gives me so much hope.
I agree. Yeah, those concrete examples really help bring those abstract concepts to life.
So hit me with some of those inspiring stories. What are some schools doing that's actually working?
Well, one example that comes to mind is this high school in California. They totally overhauled their dress code and they did it with direct input from the students. They held all these town hall meetings where students could share their experiences, voice concerns, and even propose different guidelines.
Wow, that's amazing. So the students were really involved in shaping the policies that affected them.
Exactly. And what's cool is that the dress code they ended up with was way more focused on these core principles of respect, inclusivity, and safety. It wasn't just this long list of do's and don'ts.
So it was less about dictating what they could or couldn't wear and more about creating this shared understanding.
Exactly. And the results were pretty impressive. Students felt way more ownership over the dress code, and there were way fewer dress code violations and conflicts.
That's awesome. It sounds like they really found a system that worked for everyone. Do any other examples come to mind?
Yeah, there's this middle school in Oregon. They did this Dress for Success program. And I love this one because it really shifts the focus away from restrictions and toward empowerment. So instead of telling kids what not to wear, they help them understand how their clothing choices could affect, perceptions and even opportunities.
Oh, that's cool. So it was more about like education and giving them tools to succeed.
Exactly. They had all these guest speakers from different professions, workshops on like personal style and self-expression. They even created a clothing closet where students could get like professional attire for things like job interviews or college visits.
That's going above and beyond. They were really invested in those kids' futures.
They were, and the impact was huge. Students said they felt so much more confident and prepared for the real world, and they actually started making more thoughtful choices about their clothing.
It's amazing how just like shifting your perspective can make such a huge difference.
For
But let's be realistic. Not every school has the resources or even the desire to do these kinds of innovative programs.
That's true, and that's where individual action comes in. Even if your school isn't there yet, you can still be an advocate for change.
Okay, so what are some things that students and parents can do to actually make a difference in their own schools?
Well, start small. Organize a student-led discussion group, write a letter to the editor of your school newspaper, or like present your ideas to the student council.
So it's about finding creative ways to get the conversation started.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to reach out to teachers and administrators who might be open to your ideas. You might be surprised by the support you find.
It's about planting those seeds.
Absolutely. And remember, change takes time and persistence. Don't get discouraged if you don't see results right away. Just keep pushing, keep advocating, and keep believing in the power of your voice.
It's so easy to feel powerless when you think about these huge systemic issues, but you're right, those individual actions do add up.
They really do. Every voice matters.
Well, this has been a really amazing deep dive. We've gone from the history of school uniforms and dress codes to the pros and cons, and even explored some really inspiring solutions and real world examples of schools doing things differently.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I think we've all learned a lot.
I know I have. So, as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave our listeners with a few key takeaways. First, this issue is way more complicated than it might seem at first glance. There are good points on both sides, and it's important to consider all the different perspectives. Second, there's no magic solution that works for everyone. What works for one school or community might not work somewhere else. And finally, change is possible, but it takes open dialogue, collaboration, and a willingness to, challenge the status quo.
Well said. It's a conversation we need to keep having. Keep asking questions, keep listening to each other, and keep working toward a system that's fair, equitable, and empowering for all students.
So to all our listeners out there, go out and be the change you want to see in the world. Research different approaches, have conversations with your school communities, and don't be afraid to speak up for what you believe in. Your voice matters, and you can make a difference. That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.